Music theory with OneNote, modal chords with dropped notes, comparing and contrasting the traditional chord naming system based on scale degrees with the more streamlined modal chord naming system based on distance for those chords that are a bit more detailed, that have notes that are dropped within them, this time focusing in on chords built off of those major nodes, such as the Ionian node, the major scale, the Mixolydian node, as well as the Lydian node. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS, Presentation 1397, OneNote, Modal Chords, Dropping Notes, Major, List of Presentations on the right-hand side. Also noting in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named, or multiple similarly numbered and named presentations, where we actually build these tables out in Excel, practicing not only our music skills, but our table visualization skills as well. In a prior course or section, we went over the standard naming conventions for chords that are built off of the 7 nodes in a standard collection of notes, noting that you often will see them in a table like this, which is not the most efficient way to see them because they don't give you any context about the song. Meaning, you have the major bucket, which first would come to mind the chords built off the Ionian node, but also include chords built off the Mixolydian and the Lydian node generally. You have the minor bucket, which first would come to mind the chords built off of the Aeolian node, but also include the Dorian node and the Phrygian node. You have the dominant 7 bucket, which is where the Mixolydian node chords deviated from the major chords, which happens right when the 7 happens, which means you need this whole other column for them. And then you've got the diminished and half diminished buckets, which are accommodating the Locrian chords that don't fit at all into the normal naming construction. And then we have the extension buckets for the major and minor, which is where we dumped the chords that don't fit because we needed these basic extensions. Now, in a prior course, we listed this information out a bit more efficiently by looking at each of the modal points and then thinking about the chord construction off of that modal point, and then a more streamlined way to list that chord. And we're idea being that if we were to build the system from scratch, how could we do it in the most efficient way possible, not having the idea of scale degrees because they eliminate directionality. They're basically distance terms that are not as efficient as simply coordinate terms would be if you were to just name distance relative to a certain collection of notes, which is what we propose doing at this point in time. So remember, if you're looking at the fretboard here, we have the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top. This is the collection of notes around the key of C, so C major collection of notes. What we would like to be able to do is basically build and know which type of chord I'm going to build off of each of these nodes. It would be easier to do that if I call the chords modal chords. So I already know the collection of notes because I'm going to say which collection of notes I'm working in, which is basically a key signature, which you might be familiar with sheet music, which was lost in tablature and in a DAW system. But if we bring that back, then you know the collection of notes. Therefore, you can name the chords that you're building off of the nodal points, like an Ionian chord, a Phrygian chord, an Aeolian chord. And if it's in the ocean, as we talked about, you can name that nodal point as a 6.5 chord or an Aeolian sharp chord, and then give me the shape of the chord that we're going to be constructing on that nodal point. So that's going to be the basic groundwork that we looked at in prior presentations. Now we want to get a little bit more complex and say, could we add more complexity into the system for chords that are basically dropping notes within the stack of notes? So for example, if we have a Ionian chord, so on Ionian chord, we're going to be working in the collection of notes around the key of C because that's kind of the easiest standard way to be looking at it. because there's no sharps and flats in the notes that are included. And if we build a normal major chord, therefore, it would be a C major, which is basically a triad, a 3-note major chord. Now, if I already know that I'm in the collection of notes around the key of C, I don't need to really have the C there. I'd like to name it by nodal point, because that C major, or the major extension, doesn't tell me if I'm building off of the Ionian node, or the Mixolydian node, or the Lydian node, or off of some other node which is outside the collection. In other words, this major extension for this collection of notes could be built and fit into the Ionian node built off of this node. It could be built off of the Mixolydian node built off of this node, and the Lydian node. The major extension doesn't tell me which one, which is kind of a problem. I'd like to be able to see it by calling it instead a 3-note Ionian chord. That makes it distinct in the collection of notes from the Mixolydian and the Lydian. Now you could add the C. I could call it an Ionian C2, the 2 this time representing the distance, or I can call it a 3CI, but I don't really need the note name if I had a key signature, which I would recommend we would want, the key signature giving you the overall information so that you can then map out the directionality based on the relative collection of notes that we are in. Now, if you wanted to make it, now this one is an I2. This is pure distance, meaning it's an Ionian nodal chord, and the distance to the last note is going to be 2 modal whole steps up, which is going to be 2 modal whole steps up, which would be 4 modal half steps up, or the 5th scale degree. So the nodal points then will be these nodal points. Let me see if I can bring this down a bit so I can see those on there. So now we have an Ionian, Phrygian, and Mixolydian would be the nodal points, and so that would be the idea. So this would be a cleaner way to see it. That's our starting point. Now notice I can't really do anything with that triad to drop any notes, because if I dropped notes, then it would no longer be a chord if you define a chord as 3 notes. So let's look at the next one. Let's say we had a C major 7 chord. Now this says C major 7, no 3. We're going to add the no 3. Let's just say it was a C major 7. I would rather call that then a 4-note Ionian chord, and then I've added the no 1. So let's just call it 4I or I3 for now. And that would be a more streamlined way to name it. Now let's imagine that we're going to say that we remove the 3rd. So we're going to remove the 3rd here. So the 3rd scale degree, which would be 1 modal whole step up, which would be 2 modal half steps up. In other words, in this collection of notes, it would be the Mixolydian node. Normal naming convention would be C major 7. It's a major 7, not a C7, because that 7 is now going to be a 11-note away distance, not a 10-note away distance. So therefore, this major thing kind of ties just to the triad, because really it's saying that the 3rd is going to be a major as opposed to a minor, and then everything beyond there is kind of tacked onto it, including the 7, which is different when we go to the minor, because when I have a minor tag, it basically means that if I have something greater than the stack of 3, a 4-note stack, then that 7th, which is a minor 7th, is kind of stacked in or combined in the stack under the normal naming convention. So you have to learn kind of these rules. Now, dropping the 3 usually would be kind of a problem, because you have an ambiguous chord to some degree, because now without the 3, it could be major or minor. Now here, it still kind of has a major 7. So without the 3, you can still see it as kind of a major chord, but it's somewhat ambiguous. But whatever you want to call it, it would be easier to call it a 4-note Ionian minus 1, meaning you want to go 4 modal whole steps. I mean, it's a 4-note chord, and then you remove the one that's 1 modal whole step up. So which would be the Phrygian, or an Ionian 3, -1, meaning you're going to go 3 modal whole steps up from the Ionian, which would get you to the Locrian, and then you're going to remove the one that's 1 modal whole step up. This shouldn't be the Mixolydian, it should be the Phrygian right there. Now, I could make it the tonic by making a capital I if I wanted to. I could still use modal range, meaning it's a 1-7 Ionian Locrian modal range chord, remove the one that's 1 modal whole step up, or an IN, meaning Ionian Locrian, remove the one that's 1 modal whole step up. Or if I want to add the C note, it could be an IC3, meaning I'm going to give you the nodal point and the note name, which you shouldn't need if you had a key signature, which you would like, because then it would be completely transposable. But then -1, same kind of convention would be the idea. Now, what if we drop the 5? If I say it's a C major 7 and we drop the 5, then we're just going to say that it's C major 7, no 5. The 5, although it's in the stack, isn't different typically for a major and a minor. Therefore, it's usually easier to drop the 5 without running into problems. Either way, still, it would be nicer to say it's a 4-note Ionian -2 or an Ionian 3 -2, meaning you're going to go from the Ionian and go 3 modal whole steps up, 1, 2, 3, which would make a 4-note chord, which would be the distance of 3 modal whole steps. 3 times 2 is 6 modal half steps, plus 1 would be the 7th scale degree. So I'd like to be able to, if I was doing this from scratch, memorize the distance, not the scale degree, because the distance is a coordinate system like a map. The scale degree is an ugly coordinate system because it forces you to renumber the place that you're on instead of the distance from the place that you're on, which causes all kind of problems. So if you did that, that would be the cleaner way to do it. Now note, as we go on the C major, these chord names are as clean as they get because the whole system is based on the major key. And notice that this chord name is much more efficient and gives you more information if you had a key signature, because it's written in 1, 2, 3, 4 characters, whereas this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 characters. Now you might be able to compress this down or whatever if you write it with shorthand and so on. But the point is, it's still huge. When we get to everything that's built off of any other node, it's going to be far worse, right? So let's say we built a 5-note chord. What would be the normal naming convention for that? It would be a C major 9. So now we've got the normal stack. The 9 would assume that we're still adding the 7, noting that that 9 is basically a distance term, meaning the last node that we're going to be adding is the 9th scale degree. Now, I would rather call it 8 modal whole steps up, or the one that's going to be 8 modal half steps or 4 modal whole steps up from a distance perspective. So I would like to call it a 5-note Ionian or an Ionian 4, meaning from the Ionian node, we go 4 modal whole steps up, which would be 8 modal half steps. 4 times 2 plus 1 would be the 9th scale degree if you want to think about it that way. Okay, so what if we were going to drop then? I have 3 things that I can drop, the 3, the 5, and the 7, or I can drop multiple things, but let's just do one at a time. So if I drop the 3, let's say we drop the 3 then. So now we have an issue dropping the 3 because the 3 is thought to be kind of in the stack of the major stack. So one thing that's common to do possibly is to say, look, I'm going to replace that 3 with the 9, but instead of calling it the 9, I'm going to drop it down to the one that we skipped from scale degrees, the 2. So I'm going to say the 2 is going to be replacing the 3. So you might call it a C major 7 and then you have a sus2. The sus2 means no 3. You replace the 3 with the 2. The 2 is the local distance or the octave down pitch of the 9. Does that sound correct, Ara?
Yeah, that makes sense, sort of. You're right. In jazz shorthand, when you say C major 7, sus2, what people usually mean is C, D, G, B.
Okay, let me go. Now you could get. You could argue with me on this replacing the 3rd and how you want to say it. For me, I don't really care because I would say it would be faster to say it's a 5 Ionian -1 or an Ionian 4, -1. I would just like to have the coordinates, and you know by the coordinates what the flavor of the note is. So meaning you're going to go 4 modal whole steps up to the last note, which would be 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree, and you drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up, 1 modal whole step, second modal half step, 3rd scale degree. And that way you have an efficient way to say that you're going to drop it. Now, the only thing you might argue with on that is to say, hey, look, this one gives you the octave, meaning if you were to leave it as a 9, then it would be an octave higher pitch than if you replace it with the sus2, which you would assume would be lower in pitch. Oftentimes we kind of ignore that on the guitar in particular, but if you wanted to be more specific, this one you would assume would be saying that that 4 is representing the 4 modal whole step, 8 modal half step, 9th scale degree, which would be higher in pitch if you want to get technical. So if I want to drop that last node down, I can call it an Ionian 4 to the power of, or superscript -1, or even drop the 1, just negative, assuming that's going to be 1 octave down, and then the -1. I'll talk more about that later, because I think that's another way that we can basically write this out more efficiently, possibly in a DAW system, right? So that you can actually list out your chords in a very efficient way relative to a collection of notes, adding a key signature, and then be more specific on it. But we'll get into that later. I just want to point that out now. All right, so then what if I do the next one? I drop the 5. Well, now I can drop the 5, same kind of thing. Now it's a C major 9, which assumes it adds the 7, but I'm going to drop the 5. Now, dropping the 5 usually isn't a problem. I don't need to do a sus thing here typically, because the 5 isn't giving the flavor of the chord. So I can just still say, even though it's in the stack of the triad, it's not essential, in essence, as the 3 basically is thought to be, because that defines it as major or minor. Therefore, I can just say no 5. But I can use a consistent system this way by saying it's a 5I no 2 or a 4I no 2, meaning it's an Ionian 4, go 4 modal whole steps up, which would be 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree, drop the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, which would be 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. And that way you have this consistent naming convention. I think this would be the best naming convention, although I think this one, naming the number of notes, would be easier to adopt people to from the normal system or the current system. So if I drop the 7, it would be a C major 9, no 7. Now, sometimes dropping the 7 becomes kind of a problem, particularly on the minor, because the 7 is thought to be kind of stuck to the minor collection. But because it's a normal 7, because we're comparing everything to the major scale, we can basically say C major 9, no 7. But if it was a minor chord, then we end up with a problem, because now I can't really just remove the 7 for some reason. Is that correct, Ara?
Right. So on major chords, dropping the 7 is no big deal. It just turns C major 9, no 7, into C major add 9, or even just C add 9. Nobody blinks. But on minor, yeah, you can't really say C major 9, no 7. That feels broken. The 7 is baked in. So either you call it C major add 9, or C major 9.
Appreciate it, Ara. So the point there is that that's weird, because you can't use one normal convention, because you've got all these kind of weird rules that don't really add anything, that say you can't do the same thing on the major and minor because of the weird rule. So, it would be nicer to just say the same thing. It's going to be a 5 Ionian -3 or an I4 -3, meaning we're going 4 modal whole steps up to the last node, and then we're going to drop the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, which is 6 modal half steps or the 7th scale degree. That would be a lot easier. Now note that under this system, you could say, I could go long and drop the 1 in the middle. Or you can imagine I could go short, meaning I go up to a standard triad and then add the 4th modal whole step, 8 modal half step, 9th scale degree. I would argue under this system, it would be more logical to default to going long and then dropping the one that is short, because we already know the structure or shape of the chord by the fact that it's an Ionian type chord. So therefore, the thing that I'm focused on is the last node that I'm adding. But if you drop 2 nodes, then it would make sense to go short and then add the one at the end. Why? Because it would be shorter, as opposed to going long and then drop one and then drop another. You go short and add one. So we'll talk more about that later, but that's the general idea. Okay, what if I did this one? We say it's a 6-note chord. That would be a 6 major 11, which assumes that we added a natural or normal or major scale 7 and 9, right? I would rather just call it a 6 Ionian chord or an I5, meaning we go 5 modal whole steps up, which would be 10 modal half steps, the 11th scale degree. So what if I drop then the 3rd? Now we're dropping the one that's a problem, the 3rd, from this stack. So again, this could be debated, but I'm going to say that what if I replace the 3rd with that 11th, right? So I replace the 3rd with the 11th. That means I'm going to drop it down to the equivalent local distance in scale degrees, which is the 4th that we skipped. And so I'm going to call it a C major 7 sus 4, replacing the 3rd with the 4. That basically means we dropped the 3rd and we stuck in the 4th, which is equivalent to the 11th, drop down an octave, and then we're going to add the 9. I would rather just keep the same thing, though, which would be a 6-note Ionian -1 or an I5 -1, meaning you go 5 modal whole steps up, and that would be 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree, and drop the one that's 1 modal half step up, which would mean that the last node, 5 modal whole steps up, is an octave higher. Now, I could drop it down an octave by saying it's an I5 to the superscript -1 or just negative, and then do the -1. And I think that could be consistent to any of the points, the nodal points, allowing me to change the octave as a general rule if I want to for any of the nodal points. So then if I drop the 5, shouldn't be a problem. C major 11, no 5, because the 5 is not typically a problem to drop. I would rather call it a 6I -2 or an I5 -2. I'm going to go through these a little bit quicker because I want to get to the other nodal points for the Mixolydian and the Lydian, which are a little bit more complex. So we have a C major 11, no 7. Similarly, we're dropping the 7. Not really a problem on the majors, is a problem oftentimes on the minors. And next, so I'd rather call that a 6 Ionian no 3 or an I5 no 3 or -3. And then we can say, what about we drop, if we're dropping the 9, then the normal naming convention is going to say, okay, wait a sec, I should have probably done that up here as well. Instead of going to the 9 and dropping the 7, I should have said it was a triad and then added the 9. That would be more consistent. Here, similarly, I could say it's a C major 11 and then drop the 9. But normally people say if there's only one gap, you would say it's a C major 7 and then add the 11. But again, it would be more consistent to call it a 6 Ionian -4 or an I5 -4, because the normal rule would be go 5 modal whole steps up, 5 times 2, 10 modal half steps, which is the 11th scale degree, and then drop 1 if you're only dropping 1. In this case, the one that's 4 modal half steps up. If you dropped 2, like 7 and 2, these 2 nodes, then I would go to a triad and then add the last one, because it would be shorter of a naming convention. So I'm just going by logic, distance versus length and length of name to determine what I should do, right? Which you would think would be the general idea. Okay, so then if I do the next one, it'd be a C major 13. So now we're just going to say we're adding the last one, which assumes that we added the 9 and the 11 and the 7. I'd rather just call it a 7 Ionian or an Ionian 6 modal whole steps to the end. I could drop 3 things. If I drop then once again the 3rd, that becomes a problem. I could try to do the same logic, stuffing the 13 into the 3rd slot, but if I do that, typically we don't call it a 13, we call it a 6, which is the pitch equivalent of the 13, an octave down. So that results in a C major 7 sus 6, and then I have to add the 9, add 11. Again, that's ugly. You could argue that it would be, you could name it other ways and whatnot, but the problem is, no matter how you name it, it's not uniform how you do it, right? So I'd rather just call it a 7 Ionian -1 or an I6 -1, meaning you're going 6 modal whole steps up to the end, which is 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree, and then drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up, which would be the 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree, or now when you do that, that means that the one that's going to be 6 modal whole steps up is an octave higher. You could drop the octave down if you wanted to by calling it an I6 to the superscript or power of negative or -1, and then put the -1 here, which would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characters instead of this mess, right? So then if I did the next one, we drop the 5. That's usually pretty clear. C major 13, no 5. So I'd rather call it a 7 Ionian, no 2, or an I6, no 2. We're going to drop the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. So next one, we're going to say it's going to be a C major 13, no 7. So we drop the 7th. So I would rather call it a 7I -3 or an I6 -3, meaning we're going to drop the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, which is 3 times 2, 6 modal half steps, plus 1 7th scale degree. And then we could have the next one, which is going to be the C major 13, no 9. So now we're going to the 13, we're dropping the 9. So that's fine. I'd rather call it a 7I -4 or an I6 -4, meaning we're going to be dropping the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, which is 4 times 2, 8 modal half steps, plus 1 9th scale degree. And finally, we have then this one, which you would think would be a C major 13 and then no 11. But because we don't usually go long and then drop the one in the middle, we usually go short. So we would call that C major 9 and then add the 13. I'd rather call it consistently a 7I -5 or an I6 -5, our system generally going long, and then dropping the one which would be 5 modal whole steps, 10 modal half steps, the 11th scale degree. Okay, let's do the same thing on the Lydian. If I build off of the Lydian node, the normal naming convention for the triad is the same, even though I'm on F Lydian now, same collection of notes around the key of C, which would be an F for the Lydian node. F major doesn't tell me if I'm in a major key, doesn't tell me if I'm in the collection of notes of C major or F major, right? It's ambiguous. It doesn't give me that information. But if I was to call it a 3Y, Y standing for Lydian, then I know it's going to be a triad in the collection of notes around the key of C typically. Why? Because now I have a triad on that nodal point, on the F nodal point, which means that it has to be in that specific spot, or a Lydian 2, meaning 2 modal whole steps up from that point. Now, if I add another note, that would be an F major 7. So here's the F major 7. And so now we have same idea. The 7 for the Lydian is still 11 notes away. So once again, I don't really know if this is on a Ionian node or on a Lydian node, just by the name of the chord itself. But if I called it a 4Y or a Y3, then I would. All right, now let's say we drop the 3rd. So same kind of idea off of this node. If we drop the 3rd, that's the problem one. But if I'm only going up to 7, then I can do the normal thing, which would be a C major 7, no 3, even though the 3 is very kind of important and causes problems when we go beyond that. I'd rather call it a 4Y -1 or a Y3 -1, meaning we're going to go 3 modal whole steps up from the node that we're on, which is 6 modal half steps plus 1 7th scale degree, and drop the one that's 1 modal half step up, which would be the 2nd modal half, 1 modal whole step, 2nd modal half step, 3rd scale degree. All right, if I do the next one and we say now it's going to be dropping the 5, not usually a problem to drop the 5, just an F major 7, no 5. I'd rather call it a 4Y -2 or a Y3 -2, dropping, Yeah, it should be a 2 there. Dropping the one that's 2 modal whole steps up. 2 times 2 is 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. All right, what if we then said that we had an F major 9? That would assume that we had a major 7, 11 note away 7, and a major 9. So that's fine. But again, I don't really know if that's going from the Mixolydian node or the Ionian node. I'd rather call it a 5Y or a Y4 to be more specific about the node that we're building off of. What if we drop the third? Similarly to the Ionian, I could say, well, if I drop the third and I'm adding the 9, I could drop the 9 down to the equivalent octave down scale degree, which is the one we skipped, the 2, and stuff that in. So now I have an F major 7 sus 2. I'd rather call it consistently a 5Y negative 1, meaning we go up to the end point and then we drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up. However, if I do that, the one that's 5 modal whole steps up, 4 modal whole steps up is 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree, right? If I drop it down, I can indicate that here by saying that 4 right there, I can put the power of or superscript negative to say that it's dropped down an octave from its normal stacking. And that's one way that we can do it more efficiently than this and give us the flexibility of being an octave up or an octave down. All right, if I drop the 5, that's not normally a problem. F major 9, no 5. I'd rather call it a 5Y, no 2, or a Y4, negative 2. If we drop the 7, now we have this situation where normally we would think it would be an F major 9 and then no 7, but we usually go short, which would be a F major triad, and then add the 9. It would be more consistent to just call it a 5Y, no 3, or a Y4, no 3, meaning we're going to drop the one that's 3. We're going to go long all the time as default and drop the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, which is 3 times 2, 6 modal half steps, which plus 1 would be the 7th scale degree. All right, what if we say it's a 6-note chord? So now on the Lydian, this is where it causes us a problem because now we have an F major sharp 11 because the Lydian has an augmented 4 or sharp 4, which is the equivalent of the octave up, which is the sharp 11. Okay, so now it's getting a little bit uglier than the major at this point. What if we drop the third? So you would think, and this is where it gets kind of messy, because again, you can argue whether you should do this or not, because now it has a sharp 4, which for some reason causes people angst because it's not a natural 4 to the mind. But you would think that if it was an F major sharp 11, you can use the same logic of saying, okay, well, that 11, I should be able to bring down and replace the third with it, which would result in an F major 7 sus sharp 4, and then add 9. Now, again, you might argue you can't do that because it needs to be not a sharp 4. You can only replace it with a, okay, whatever. The point to me is the whole thing, all these rules don't make, you should just have a coordinate system that should be a Y5 negative 1 or a 6Y negative 1, meaning you're going to go 5 modal whole steps up from the root, which will take me here, 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree, and then you remove the one that's 1 modal half step up, which would be the second modal, 1 modal whole step, second modal half step, 3rd scale degree. And if you want to drop this one down an octave, you can just superscript it negative 1 if you want to be more specific. And that way everything is uniform and easier to understand. So what if I add the next one? It would be an F major sharp 11 and then no 5. Pretty straightforward typically. We can just remove the 5. I'd rather call it a 6Y no 2 or a Y5 negative 2. And same kind of logic, although we have that sharp in there, making it ugly. The next one, it would be an F major sharp 11, no 7. So once again, we're just going to drop the 7. So I'd rather call it a 6Y no 3 or minus 3 or a Y5 minus 2. And then the next one would be an F major 11, F major sharp 11, no 9. Now again, this one gets a little wonky because that might not be the way that because you could say it's an 11 and then remove the 9, but usually we go short. So that would be an F major 7 and then add and then add the sharp 11, which might be the better way, the more consistent way to name it under the normal naming convention. But either way, it's still ugly because you're jumping back and forth between two different conventions. It would be cleaner to just call it a 6 Lydian -4 or a Y5 -4, meaning we're always going to go long and then drop the 1 here unless we're dropping 2 notes, and it would be shorter text-wise to go short and then add the long, which we'll talk about in a future presentation. All right, and then if we did the 13, it would be an F major 13, but then we need the extension of the sharp 11 if we're building off of the Lydian, because the Lydian has that 11. So the 13 kind of assumes that you would have a normal 11 in there, but then you have to indicate with the extension, no, it's not a normal 11, it's a sharp 11, right? So, but it would be more consistent. I would already know that. If I say, hey, look, I'm building off of the Lydian, I know the distance from the Lydian, it's the Lydian distance, so it's just a 7-note Lydian or a Lydian 6. And then we can go from there and say, okay, well, what if I'm dropping the 3rd? Again, it gets ugly. You can argue whether this is the best way to say it, but if I was going to use the same logic, I could say, okay, well, if I drop the 3rd and I had the 13, I'm going to drop the 13 down to the local distance, which would be the 6th that was skipped, which is a normal 6 now. It doesn't have a sharp, so maybe you can replace the 3rd with that, which would be an F major 7, and then sus 6, and then you have to add the 9 and then add the sharp 11. So you can argue whether that's the best way to do it, but it's ugly no matter what you do. It'd be a lot cleaner to just call it a 7Y -1 or Y6 -1, meaning we're going to go 6 modal whole steps up, which is 12 modal half steps or the 13th scale degree, and then we're going to drop the one that's 1 modal half step up, which would be 1 modal whole step, 2 modal half step, 3rd scale degree up. And then if you want to drop this one down an octave, that 6, you can superscript it to a negative or -1, and that would be more efficient by far than this, only giving you 1, 2, if you add another character, 3, 4, 5 characters instead of that, right? So, and then we'd have, if we want an F major 13 sharp 11, meaning we're dropping the 5, so it'd be an F major 13. I have to indicate that there's a sharp 11 in there, and then I could say no 5. So it would be cleaner to just call it a 7Y -2 or a Y6 -2. And then what if I want to drop the 7? So then I'd have to call it an F major 13 sharp 11, and then just no 7, which would be cleaner to say it's a 7Y -3 or a Y6 -3. And then what if I want to drop the 9? Now that we're all the way up, I can just say it's an F major 13 sharp 11, no 9. But it would still be more consistent to say it's a 7 Y -4 or Y6 -4. And then finally, if I'm going to be dropping the 11, I would want to go short typically instead of going long. So instead of calling it an F major 13 sharp 11 and then no sharp 11, I could just remove the sharp 11. So now it's going to be an F major 9 and then add the 13. Notice the ambiguity here, because if I drop the sharp 11, again, it doesn't tell me if I'm building off of the Ionian node or off of the Lydian node, right? Whereas if I did the same thing this way, if I said it was a Lydian 6 -5, we always go long and drop the 1 in the middle, then although I dropped this nodal point, which is the only difference in distance, I still know it's a Lydian chord, or I'm building off of the Lydian chord, because I'm telling you the nodal point that I'm building off of, which would be useful within the context of songs. All right, now we're going to go to the Mixolydian, the last major nodal point, which deviates right when we get to the 7, and that's quite early in the stack. So in the collection of notes around the key of C, that would be the G. All right, so if we did this one, we're going to say then the normal 3 note would be a G major. That doesn't tell me if it's a Ionian nodal point or Lydian nodal point or a Mixolydian. But as soon as I add the 7, then I have to switch conventions to a G7, the 7 now indicating that it has a normal triad with a major 3rd, but a minor 7, which basically is the Mixolydian node. You might as well call it a 4x, x standing for Mixolydian, or an x3, meaning it's a Mixolydian nodal point, and you're going 3 modal whole steps up, which would be 6 modal half steps, or the last note would be the 7th from a scale degree standpoint. If I start there and say, now I'm going to drop the 3rd. So if I drop the 3rd, it would be now not a G major 7, but a G7, no 3rd. And so I'd rather call it a 4x for Mixolydian -1, or an x4 -1, meaning we go 4 modal whole steps up, which would 3 modal whole. This should be an x3, a 4x. This should be an x3. 3 modal whole steps up, 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree. And then we drop the one that's 1 modal half step up. If I say that it's going to be dropping the 5, we can call that a G7, no 5. So I'd rather call it a 4x, no -2, or an x3 -2, meaning we go 3 modal whole steps up, 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree, drop the one that's 2 modal whole steps up, 4 modal half steps, 5th scale degree. All right, and then if I add another one, we're going to say, okay, now it's a G9. The G9 is going to assume a major 3rd and a flat 7, and now we're going to go to the 9. So okay, so that's great. I'd rather call it a 5x or an x4 for a Mixolydian 4 modal whole step chord. Now, if I drop the 3rd, then again, I'm going to use the same logic. You can argue against that you should say it some other way, but if I used the same logic and to say, okay, I'm going to replace the 3rd with the 9, but drop the 9 down an octave, the 9 would be equivalent to the 2 that we have removed. That would be a G7 sus2. Now again, so I'm just going to, so if I wanted to be consistent, though, it would be better to call it a 5x -1 or an x4 -1, meaning go 4 modal whole steps up, 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree, and then drop the one that's 1 modal whole step up, 2 modal half steps, 3rd scale degree. If I want to drop this last nodal point down, the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, the last node, I can superscript it with a negative or -1 to be more specific. And then we could say, okay, what if I drop the 5? That would be a G9, no 5. I'd rather call it a 5x -2 or an x4 -2. What if we are going to drop then the 7? Now that becomes an issue because the 7 is the distinguishing factor to make it a G, a Mixolydian type chord rather than a major chord. So if you drop the 7, now you can't go long. You would think you would go, okay, well, that would be a G9, no 7. But if you say G9, no 7, you dropped the thing that converted it from being a Mixolydian type chord. So you want to go short, typically, you'd have to call it a G major to the triad and then add 9. So, right? So now I had to go back to the triad. I lose the Mixolydianness of it, even though I'm still building on the Mixolydian node. It would be nice to know that you're building on the Mixolydian node by calling it a 5x -3 or an x4 -3, going long, dropping the one that's 3 modal whole steps up, 6 modal half steps, 7th scale degree, because that tells you contextually where you are in the shape, and then you can determine what that means by the distances that are included, right? So then you have a G11. A G11 assumes a major 3rd, a minor 7, and then the 9 is major, and then the major 11, right? So I'd rather call it a 6x or an x5. What if I drop the 3rd? Again, I'm going to use the same logic, which you could argue against, but if I add the 11 has a local distance that's dropped down an octave of what we skipped, which was the 4. So if I drop the 3rd and replace it, you would think the name would be G7 sus4 and then add 9. Again, you can argue against that, but to be consistent, whatever you want to call it, I'd rather call it a 6x -1 or an x5 -1, meaning we're going 5 modal whole steps up to the end. 5 times 2 is 6 modal half steps plus 1 is the 11th scale degree, and dropping the one that's 1 modal half step up, which would be 1 modal whole step, 2 modal half steps, third scale degree. And if I want to drop the one that's 5 modal whole steps up down an octave, then I can just superscript it to a negative or a -1. All right, and then if I drop the 5, that's usually no problem. G11, no 5. I'd rather call it a 6x -2 or an x5 -2. If I want to drop then the 7, then I can call it, again, this is a problem because now I'm dropping the one that is the defining characteristic for it being like a G11 versus a G major 11. So I'm dropping that one. So now you got to think, oh, wait, I'm still building off of like the Mixolydian nodal point, but I'm dropping that distance that makes it a Mixolydian chord. So now I have to revert back to a major chord, even though I'm building off of the Mixolydian node. You see why that's kind of ugly? To me, that makes no sense. So now instead of calling it a G11, no 7, I have to call it a G major 11 if I'm being correct, because the 7 that I have removed was never included. Like I would have included a flat 7, right? But if I never included the 7, then I don't know if it's flat or not. So therefore, you should call it a G major 11, no 7, not a G11, no 7. Again, all that ambiguity is gone if you just say, hey, look, I'm building off of the Mixolydian node. It's a 6x, no 3, or an x5, -3, meaning just go 5 modal whole steps up from the Mixolydian node and then drop the one that's 3 modal whole steps up. I don't care if that's the 7th or the one that's different than the major, because I'm telling you the intervals by the node that I'm on, not by the major intervals. I don't care what the major intervals are, or I do, but I know the distances by nodal point, not by comparison to the major. So then the next one is going to be if I drop the 9, it would be, or drop the, what am I dropping now? It would be a G7 add 11, because instead of going a G11, drop the 9, we have to go short, which is now G7. So now it's back to G7, not G major 7, because the 7 is now a minor 7. And then we're adding the last one, which is the 11. Be more consistent to go long as the default. So I would call it a 6x no -4 or a x5 -4, meaning we are going to go long 5 modal whole steps up and then drop the one that's 4 modal whole steps up, 8 modal half steps, 9th scale degree. All right, the next one. If we had then a 13, we're adding a 7-note chord now, which would be a G13, which assumes a major 3rd, a minor 7, and then a major 9, 11, and 13. So what if I drop the 3rd? If I use the same logic, it would be this ugly thing. You can argue that it should be something different, whatever. I'm just going to say whatever you do, it's confusing. And that would be, okay, the 13 is equivalent to the 6 that we skipped. So if I drop the 3, I can replace it with the 13, which I bring down to the 6 and replace it with. So that would be a G7 sus 6, and then I have to add the 9 and add the 11. Whatever you want to call it, it would be easier to just say it's a 7x -1 or an x6 -1, meaning I'm going to go 6 modal whole steps up from the root, which is 12 modal half steps, 13th scale degree, and then I'm removing the one that's 1 modal whole step up, which is 2 modal half steps, 3rd scale degree. And if I want to drop that 6th modal whole step down an octave and have the same pitch but octave lower, I can just superscript it negative or -1, and boom, you have something that's way less ugly than that. And then if we remove the 5, it would be a G13, no 5. I'd rather call it a 7x, no 2, or an x6 -2. And then the next one would be, we remove the 7. That becomes a problem again, because the 7 is once again the thing that determines that it's going to be not a major, but a Mixolydian. So you would think it would be a G13, no 7. But if I don't have the 7, I'm not sure if I dropped the major 7 or the minor 7. And by default, we would assume we dropped the major 7. Therefore, you would call it a G major 13, no 7, not a G13, no 7, which seems lame because that doesn't tell you which nodal point that you're building off of. Whereas if you said it was a G13 No 7, it would at least tell you that you're building off the Mixolydian node for the most part, although you're dropping the distance that's different from the major. So it would be a lot better to call it a 7x negative 3 or an x6 negative 3, because that will tell you the distance to the last node and the node that you're dropping. I don't care that I'm dropping the distance that's different than the major. I mean, I would like to know that to know the flavor of the chord that I'm building, but I should be able to know that by the distance, not by the comparison to the major, right? So then if I was going to drop the 9, it would be a G13 No 9, which I'd rather call a 7x negative 4 or an x6 negative 4. And then finally, if we're going to be dropping then the 11, then you would think it would be a G13 No 11, but we usually don't go long and then drop short. Under the standard convention, we go short and then add the long, which would give us G9, which is a G9, not a G major 9, because now we have the 7, which is the distinguishing factor, and then add the 9. I'd rather call it a 7x negative 5 or an x6 negative 5, meaning the distance to the last note is going to be 6 modal whole steps times 2, 12 modal half steps plus 1 13th scale degree, and we're dropping the one that's going to be 5 modal whole steps up, 10 modal half steps, 11th scale degree. If I dropped 2 notes, then that's the only time I would go short and then add the long. Why? Because it would be a shorter name that way to do it. So that's going to be, you know, the kind of Occam's razor or approach, right? I'm going to do the most efficient naming convention. There should be rules, in my opinion, to say which would be the best naming convention, and it should be named based on functionality, what tells you the most about the functionality of the song, and then if all else is the same, the length of the naming convention should be the tiebreaker.